Hello Year 7 and welcome to your next lesson in the shifting stakes topic. In today's lesson we're going to cover the water cycle and drinking water. My name is Mrs. Chiverton, I'm one of the science directors and I'm going to be taking you through your learning today. Before we start, there are a few things that you are going to need. You're going to need some common household items to create a water bag display. There's a plastic Ziploc type food bag, permanent marker or markers, some water just straight from the tap, some blue food colouring if you can, some clear sticky tape, and there is a printable method in this folder as well that you can print off, but I do go through it on the PowerPoint. And in addition, can you switch off any media devices that you have around you other than the one that you're using to watch this video, and also make sure you've got either your exercise book or a pen, pencil, ruler and some paper with you as well in order to record this information. Anything you do on paper can be taken back into school with you when you're back into your lessons and put into your exercise book. So this is just to get you thinking about what we've been saying and what can you actually recall from previous lessons. So this is talking about changes of state, how things move from ice to water to steam and back again. And you can see there that there are 5 boxes missing. So we know that ice exists in a solid state and water can also exist as a gas in the form of steam. What is it when it's water as we'd normally recognise it? And what are the names of those changes of state that happen? I'm just going to give you about 30 seconds to jot that down in your exercise book. Okay, so hopefully you've got those all right. I'm just going to pop the answers for you so that you can check them off. And if you missed any of them or misspelt them, you can make those corrections now. So when we change from solid ice to liquid water, it's a process called melting. When we go from liquid water to water as a gas or steam, it's evaporation. And when we turn back the opposite way, when we go from steam, the gas, into liquid water, it's condensation. And when we go from liquid water into ice, the solid form, it's a process called freezing. And we need to use those keywords as much as we can in our answers through this topic. So in terms of our learning journey, we're quite close to the end of our learning journey in the shifting states topic. And in this situation, we are going to be looking at how does water from the sea become clouds and then become the water that I am able to drink. So our challenge today is for you to be able to describe the stages of the water cycle and suggest which sources of water might be used for drinking. And then our aspire is to be able to explain how the water cycle conserves water and to explain how water is made safe to drink. And those underlined words are some of our command words that tell us what we're going to be doing in those activities. So our starter, this is looking back a little bit at key stage 2. And I'm just wanting you to have a quick think about how does a puddle become a cloud. Try and use as many keywords as you can and write this down in your exercise book. And I'm going to give you about 30 seconds just to include that. Okay, so hopefully you will have used some of those keywords we looked at in the pre-starter. What I would have hoped for you to see to go from the puddle to the cloud would be that you were talking about heat from the sun, heating up the water and causing it to evaporate. So that's how it leaves the puddle in the first place. And then our second keyword there, that it condenses in the sky and turns back into a liquid which forms the clouds and ultimately, of course, will fall as rain. So our topic today is all about the water cycle, and you can put that as a title in your exercise book or on your piece of paper. And what we're going to be looking at is how this continuous process happens where we have water being moved through different areas of our planet. So the first stage we can think about is evaporation. And this is when water passes from a liquid to a gas without boiling. So all liquids will do this over a period of time. And you can see from the picture there that we've got that example of evaporation happening from the surface of a lake. And that's how water goes up into our atmosphere. So it evaporates from rivers, from lakes, from seas, from oceans. Any large body of water will have that evaporation process happening. And in fact, the oceans are the greatest source of evaporation of water, which then moves into our atmosphere. So that's one of our first stages of the water cycle. The next stage we need to think about is condensation. As that water vapour moves up into the atmosphere, it becomes colder. And as it cools down, it turns back into liquid water, that condensation process. And the pictures at the bottom will remind you of what condensation can look like when water vapour hits cold surfaces. And in our atmosphere, it forms clouds in the sky. So this is actual condensation in action. And there are lots of different kinds of clouds. You know, if you look out on any one day, you can see different cloud formations. But they're all made of water vapour that has cooled and condensed in the sky. Sometimes if the wind is fast enough, you can actually watch the clouds move. And we wouldn't have rain, thunderstorms, hurricanes, rainbows, snow without clouds, because that is how the water goes up into the sky that produces all of these phenomena. And the atmosphere would actually be really quite boring if the sky was always clear blue. And it's the clouds that actually make it look interesting when we're looking up there. Now another area, and this is touching a little bit on GCSE, is transpiration. It's another way in which water can move from the earth up into the atmosphere. And you can see by the picture there on your screen that water is absorbed by the roots of plants, which you know, and that water will travel up through the stem and into the leaves of plants where it's used for photosynthesis. But what will happen is that some of that water that's taken up and isn't used for photosynthesis and growth will then evaporate from the surface of the leaves. Okay, and again, it's the sun that creates the heat, which causes that water to transpire. And you'll get a chance to look at leaves and the tiny holes under the surface called stomata through which they are allowed to leave. But that's another process by which water vapour gets into our atmosphere from the earth. And then our final way is looking at how water gets back to the earth from our atmosphere. And that's the process called precipitation. And it's what gives us our rivers, our oceans and our seas. Oceans and seas supply most of the water that evaporates, but then it then falls back to the land and to the oceans as rain, sleet, snow and hail. These are all types of precipitation, and it simply depends on the temperature as to which version of them will actually fall. Oceans and seas are salty, whilst rivers and lakes are fresh water. And we need to remember that when we're looking at getting potable water in a later stage in our lesson. And just as a reminder, there are 4 major oceans which actually cover a huge part of the earth. The Pacific Ocean on its own covers almost half of the earth. And actually a massive percentage of our land is covered, our planet is covered with oceans. So I've done that in stages, but the water never stops moving. Snow and rain fall to the earth from clouds. The rain and melted snow run down into rivers and lakes, sometimes crashing over waterfalls, and that water eventually flows into the oceans. And then the whole process starts again with evaporation from those oceans, rivers and lakes forming clouds through the process of condensation, and the water cycle continues. And this is why we call it a cycle, because it's a continuous process that is happening all the time on our planet. Just to recap, When we think about our bodies of water, our rivers and our oceans, we will be looking at the process, first of all, of evaporation. So the water is a liquid, and it is the heat from the sun that actually warms the surface of the water. And as it gets warmer, it changes and begins to evaporate. And what's happening there is the gas is turning into water vapour, and this will rise up into our atmosphere. Of course, when it gets into that colder atmosphere, it cools down and it forms clouds. And this process is called condensation. The next stage is when a cloud gets full, it begins to rain, or hail, or sleet, or snow. And this process is called precipitation. And altogether, those stages make up the water cycle. And we can show it very easily in a diagram like this. And this keeps happening all the time. It's a continuous process. Okay, so I'm going to give you 2 minutes in order to record that information, and I've given you some structure here, so you need to copy out and complete these sentences that summarise the water cycle. You have 2 minutes. Okay, you should have finished that now. If you haven't quite finished it, you can pause the video and complete the rest of it. If not, the answers are about to pop up and you can just use that to help you finish that information. So, evaporation comes when the heat from the sun warms up all the groundwater and it turns to water vapour. Condensation then takes over. As it goes up to form the clouds, the water vapour cools down and changes to a liquid. Precipitation happens when the water drops get too big. Water falls as rain, snow, sleet and hail. And this process keeps happening again and again, and so it's called the water cycle. So this is a 1 minute 30 task that you can have to actually try and match up those key words to their actual meanings to make sure you've absolutely nailed them. So each of the words on the left is a key word, and you've got the examples next to them of what those words potentially could mean. So again, I'm going to give you 1 minute 30 in order to complete that activity. Fabulous. So hopefully you've managed to match all of those up. So we'll just check those off. Precipitation. So that's your rain, hail, sleet and snow that falls from the clouds. Condensation. That's when the water vapour cools down and turns into clouds. Evaporation. We can think of that as the opposite process. And that's when the sun heats up water from the sea and it goes into the air. Groundwater flow. This is when water flows through rocks and soil underground. Surface runoff is when the water runs off the surface of the ground into things like rivers, lakes, etc. And then transpiration, when the sun heats up water from leaves and trees, and again it evaporates into the atmosphere. So hopefully you've nailed all of those keywords and you'll be able to use those as we move through the rest of this topic. So now this is an optional activity if you were able to get the resources that were mentioned at the beginning of the video. What we're going to do is going to build a water cycle in the bag, and you are going to produce something similar to the images that are here on the screen for you. You do need to follow the instructions carefully and do them in the right order. And what you may want to do is to pause the video whilst you're actually setting this up. So, as I've said, you need a few common household items. So you need that plastic Ziploc style bag. It doesn't need a particularly big one. You can see the size of it in the pictures there. Some permanent markers, some water, some food colouring and some clear tape. Now this is an optional activity. It will be done in classrooms, but if you don't have those resources, don't worry about it. You can always catch up with it when you get back into school, in which case just forward fast through the rest of this part of the video until you get to the next activity. But if you are intending to do it, our first stage is to decorate the bag, and we need to do that before we do anything else. This is where we need permanent markers, because if we used washable ones, of course they would wash off straight away. So what you need to do on your bag is to draw a sky in the upper half of your plastic bag. Include things like clouds and the sun, as they're really important examples of the water cycle. The next step is to prepare your water. So fill up a cup with regular tap water and add a couple of drops of blued food colouring to it. Swirl the cup of water a few times just to mix the food colouring in so it's a nice solid blue. And then you need to very carefully pour it into the plastic bag and zip it closed, because we don't want any water to be able to escape. Now it might be an idea to get somebody else to help you so you can pour and they can hold, or vice versa. That will probably be the easiest way to do it. And then step 3 is to hang up the bag. We hang it up on a window that gets lots of sunshine for your best results. Make sure you ask permission of an adult before you do this at home, of course. Cut 2 long pieces of sticky tape and stick them to the corner of your bag, and then press the tape very, very tightly to the window. You might need a few extra ones, but try and tape it at the top so you're not interfering with what you can see happening in your water cycle bag. Now, you're going to have to be patient at this point and either wait a couple of hours before you check on your experiment. You should start to see a change in your bag happening between 2 hours and a day, and that'll depend a little bit on the amount of sun and the time of day that you started. But keep checking back on your experiment a few times a day over the next few days, or any time that it's sunny, to see the water cycle in progress. And hopefully what you will see is something similar to this. And you will be able to mark on the things that are actually happening. Okay, so we should see evaporation happening from the water. You should be able to see some kind of condensation happening up at the top there. And then you should be able to see water running back down, precipitation, back into that plastic bag. And here's another example of it. Now, if you're not very good at drawing, that's absolutely fine. You can see on this second version that they've kept it much more simple, with just the cloud and the land and the water surface being marked, and then using arrows and descriptions. So you'll need to do this section over a few days, and once you've made your observations, so that you can make a note of these questions that you're going to have to answer. So, describe how the temperature and sunlight affects your water cycle in a bag. Will the amount of water in the bag change? That'll be a yes or no answer, but I want you to explain why you've said yes or no. And number 3, how does this explain how the water cycle could conserve the water on Earth? Now, if you're not sure what the word conserve means, it means that it saves it, or it doesn't change it, or it doesn't alter it. Okay, so you'll have the same amount at the start as you would have at the end. So make a note of those questions now, and leaving space to write the answers in as well. And we'll come back to those answers at another stage when you bring your work back into school. Okay, hopefully you've got those questions down. I'm going to move on, but if you need to get those questions down again, you can always pause the video and complete those questions. So, all life on Earth depends on water, and the figure below shows an iceberg floating on the sea. And this is a real-life application of the water cycle. So this could be an exam-style question that you might be asked. Explain how water molecules in the iceberg could end up as water in a lake. And you can see there that we've allocated 4 marks to this question. It's an explain question, and it's explain how. So you've got to describe in detail, using as many keywords as you can from the previous section about the water cycle, how that process could actually happen. Now again, I've allocated you a time, so you have 2 minutes to attempt that question in your exercise books. Okay, hopefully you've managed to get all of that answer down with as many keywords as possible. So you can get a different coloured pen, and this is your opportunity to self-assess what you've actually done. Now, when we talk about a question like this, obviously if nothing is relevant to that actual question, you would get no marks for it. A level 1 answer would cover 1 to 2 marks, and there you might have included a few basic things about the water cycle, but you haven't necessarily linked it to the iceberg, or it might be a bit vague or inconsistent. To get the 3 to 4 marks or level 2 answer, you must have a detailed and coherent explanation of how water molecules transfer through the water cycle from one form or area to another. And it has to be linked logically, and you have to have put it in the context of the iceberg. So bearing that in mind, have a think about when I put the potential content you could have included, have you also thought about it logically and sensibly and linked it to the iceberg, not just generally about the water cycle? Now, we call this indicative content. We wouldn't expect you to get absolutely every bit of this into your answer, but you should have included something about the water being in the iceberg being a solid and it melting to form a liquid that forms the sea. You may have talked about the water evaporating from the surface of the sea and going up into the air. You should have talked about it cooling to form clouds at that particular point. And then those clouds, you might have been talked about them being moved by the winds and then it falling as rain into a lake from which we can get our drinking water. So read through your answer and just check, do you think you've covered enough detail of that to give yourself 4 marks? Maybe you think you've missed a key point out or it's not as well ordered, you might only give yourself 3 marks. If there's anything you feel you could add to your answer, please add it in a different coloured pen so that you've got a model answer there for the future. I'll give you about 30 seconds just to do that. Okay. So we're going to move on now and look at something called potable water. Now this isn't portable water, which my daughter used to think I meant when I talked about potable water. It's not water we can carry around. It's simply water that is safe to drink. But we need to think about, where does it all come from? I know we can get it out of the tap in this country and we can get it out of bottles, but where does it come from originally to get into those taps and bottles? And of course, is all water safe to drink? Can we just, when we're out and about walking, just go to a waterfall or a lake or a river and take some water, and is it safe to drink? So all of our drinking water does originally come from the sky as part of the water cycle. But depending where on the land the water falls, different minerals might get dissolved into that water. And that, for example, is how we get mineral water, the kind that we put in bottles and pay a lot for in the shops. So different water will end up with different combinations of minerals dissolved in it. And so long as those mineral levels aren't too high, that could mean that the water is safe to drink. So how would you feel about getting your drinking water from here? Would you be happy going and dipping a glass into that lake and actually drinking that water? Or do you think there might be stuff in there that might need removing in order to make it safe to drink? So, to make this water safe to drink, we would have to remove any solids that are in there and also to sterilise the water, which is to kill the bacteria. The solids would be removed by filtering processes, and then chlorine is usually in this country added to the water to sterilise it. Alternatively, we can use ultraviolet light, or ozone can be added to sterilise water as well. And when water is sterilised, it will kill bacteria that would normally make us ill if we were to consume them. So it means that we can't get ill anymore. And that water would then be classed as potable water, water that is safe to drink. So this is an activity for you to try to see how much you can remember about making potable water and how to make it safe to drink. So let's imagine that this little person here is called Fred. And he is pretty scared of drinking water because he's frightened it might be dirty and he thinks it's going to make him poorly. So what we need you to do is write an email to Fred explaining why the water that comes out of our taps is actually safe for him to drink. So you need to think about what it means to be safe to drink and what processes the water will have gone through before it gets to his tap so that it does mean it's safe to drink. And I'm going to give you 4 minutes in order to do that. Okay, that's time's up. Hopefully you've managed to get an email that's going to convince poor Fred that he's actually safe to drink water from our taps. So, make sure that you have included these things, that water from the tap and from the bottles is safe. So please make sure you've put that statement in somewhere in your answer, in your email to Fred. Water from lakes, rivers and reservoirs is treated to make it safe to drink. You should have given some details. So solids removed by filtering. Chlorine, ozone or UV light is used to sterilise the water. And when the water's sterilised, then the bacteria are killed so you can't get ill anymore. Okay, so hopefully you've got all of those points, or you've amended your answer to include those points as well. And Fred will be convinced that he is safe to drink the water. So this is a remaining activity for this session. These are some key learning points for you to add to your notes. So please make sure that you've included them. I'm going to allow 4 minutes, but if you get this done before then, you can always move the video on. So please make sure that you have got in your notes that the water cycle involves evaporation, transpiration, condensation and precipitation to cycle water. So that's 4 keywords plus the keyword of the water cycle included in one sentence. You need to write down that potable water is safe to drink. You need to write down that potable water has low levels of minerals and bacteria, and that's why it is safe for us to drink it. And that we make water potable by filtering to remove any solids and using a sterilising agent to kill any harmful bacteria. Okay. So the final task for you to do today is to complete the Google quiz, and this will be automatically marked, so you'll get some instant feedback on that. But don't forget to keep going back to your water cycle if you made one and check that that is also working, and complete the work in your books for those 3 questions that you wrote down earlier on. Thank you for listening today.